Welcome to our fourth edition of Is the Moon Landing a Hoax? So, we're going to be dealing a lot of our time tonight on photos. So, it requires some setup. First, recall that all photos can be altered. The originator can alter it, users can alter it. A lot of what we're seeing online, especially coming from the people who are trying to support the idea of a moon hoax, is we're looking at pictures that have been altered after the fact. Um, Things being cropped out, things being added in, filters being changed to make things appear that aren't necessarily in the photo. One of the big issues, and this is an area where I don't particularly claim huge expertise. Um, if you've never worked with a film camera before, if you've never developed film, uh, you probably lack the expertise to critique a film photography in a way where you understand what's going on. And I definitely get the impression that a lot of the people out there who are using the photos that came from the moon as their primary justification, uh, I don't think a lot of them have a lot of expertise in film usage. I came from the era where we did use film loaded cameras. I only had some very minimal experience with actually developing film. Uh, we got to do that as part of a high school project. I did have a friend in high school who was a photography buff. He was kind of like a lot of photographs for the yearbook and stuff like that. And so he was constantly developing, and so I have a little bit of exposure on that side. Uh, but I doubt a lot of the people touting photographs as their primary evidence even have that much experience. And I think it's fair to ask people, what do you know about film? What do you know about film photography? What do you know about developing it? And like I said, as I've said a couple of times during this, is there's a tendency for assertions to be made with limited or poor references, and then people have a tendency to go back and keep re-referencing things to where no one even knows where the original claim comes from. This is definitely true in the photographic realm. A lot of things that can come up, lens flares, dust, lighting, filtering, can completely alter what happens in a picture. Developing film can introduce all kinds of artifacts into the process. Things appear on the picture that weren't there in reality. Just because it's in the picture doesn't mean it's really there. Take, for example, people have pictures that they're absolutely adamant are pictures of ghosts. And basically, it's an example where maybe a double exposure can be a better explanation for it. Or how about orbs? The idea of supernatural balls of energy showing up in the back of photos. And I knew well in the Air Force believed that they were actually taking pictures of things that were out of our visual range. Believed in the orbs, and you could see them in the photos, but I doubt they were anything real. And then there was a time period where people were photographing what were being touted as fourth dimensional beings, little racing objects that would appear over canyons and such. And that turned out to be purely an artifact. So, I mean, if you basically go on the premise that so if you see a line coming down in a NASA photo, and you say, well, that's got to be a string. It can't possibly be anything else. Well, then you got to explain why you think that pictures depicting ghosts, orbs, and fourth dimensional beings uh, are not real. Because if you believe everything in a photo is really there, then you got to believe what you're seeing in these other photos are really there as well. You have to be consistent. Where I'm being consistent is I have extreme doubts of anything I'm seeing in a photo. Uh, it's if you're not seeing it with your eyes, you don't know what you're actually seeing. But I mean, for the most part, I mean, you can see the objects, and where it really comes down to is uh, faking the photography only makes sense if you have an actual impediment to the astronauts getting there. And the biggest one that's always brought up is radiation. That's something I dealt with in the previous video. Please go back and look at it. If you remove all the impediments for the astronauts to get to the moon, if you get rid of all the good reasons they come up with, and all you're down left with is the photos, then the photos don't make any sense, because you can sit there and say, well, there's a string I think they're using to move the astronauts around with to make them look like they're bouncing around. Well, why would they need to do that if all the other arguments that would stop them from getting there have been already shot down? All right, so let's get into this proper. So one of the arguments that are brought up is that NASA and the US government would have never risked showing dead or dying astronauts, which would have ruined their reputation. So that's the reason why they would have never sent astronauts. Uh, However, we have the example with Apollo 1's crew, which was burned on the launch pad due to them using 100% oxygen in a bad escape hatch, both of which were really, really stupid. NASA faced congressional hearings, and the failure was repeated often in the media. Uh, every time something would come up in terms of a glitch, they would hearken back to the Apollo 1 astronauts. Why would they have, if NASA would be terrified of putting an astronaut into space, why would they put him on a launch pad with potential, basically a mini crematorium full of oxygen and sparks? Another claim is that the space program was something fake that was designed to distract people from the Vietnam War, which ended almost at the same time. Well, the U.S. involvement in Vietnam predates Apollo by 6 years. The Apollo program started at a point when Vietnam wasn't even talked about much in the media. The Vietnam drawdown of troops began months prior to the moon landing. Troop strength was down 15% on the first moon landing. The 1971 landings were accompanied by 60% of the American troops going home. The last moon mission was in 1972, and the U.S. continued to try to intervene in Vietnam till 1975. So there's no coincidence in the dates at all. That's just nonsensical. There are identical backgrounds in the photos, which according to their captions were taken miles apart, suggesting that a painted background was used. Uh, Backgrounds were not identical, they were similar. The moon has a lot of similar landscapes. What appears as nearby hills in some photos are actually mountains many miles away. On Earth, objects that are farther away will appear fainter and less detailed. On the moon, there's no atmosphere or haze to obscure faraway objects, thus they may appear clearer and nearer. The number of photos taken is implausibly high, up to one photo per 50 seconds. We talked about the camera gear in a previous video, but the simplified gear had fixed settings and allowed 2 photos per second. Many of them were taken immediately after each other, so stereo pairs or panoramic sequences could be created. The calculation of 1 per 50 seconds was based on a lone astronaut on the surface and does not take into account that there were 2 astronauts sharing the workload. And this particular photo I got up here is this photo contains artifacts that looks like C, the letter C is on a rock and on the ground. And these may be labeled studio props. The C-shaped objects were most likely printing imperfections, like we were talking about at the beginning, and do not appear in the original film from the camera. It's been suggested that C could be a coiled hair. And if you were going to label props, you would probably put something on that you could tear off rather than actually imprinting the object with the code letter or number. The book Moonshot contains an obviously fake composite photo of Alan Shepard hitting a golf ball on the moon with another astronaut. The publishers of the book, or the authors of the book, decided to use uh, the composite that they created rather than the existing real images from the TV monitor. The editors felt were too grainy for their book. The book publishers did not work for NASA. Who filmed Neil Armstrong stepping on the moon? You watched The Whitest Kids You Know, you'd know the answer to that. But cameras on the lunar module did. The Apollo TV camera mounted on the modularized equipment stowage assembly of the Apollo lunar module gave a view from the exterior while still on the module's ladder steps. Armstrong deployed the camera from the side of the lunar module. And then item comes up about the missing telemetry tapes. There's some 45 missing tapes. However, the entirety of the tapes aren't missing, as a lot of people allege. Portions were recovered from tracking stations and secondhand recordings. Now, a lot of people say, well, that's just ridiculous. NASA would never get rid of something so incredibly valuable. Obviously, you don't know the government. Personally watched the destruction of incredibly valuable data myself from other military endeavors. I watched the destruction of 40 years of data that was a continuous monitoring of Earth seismic activity, information that would probably advance our understanding of the Earth, seismicity, etc., light years into the future in terms of their ability to understand what's going on. They figured it was too much work to come up with a way of turning this over to civilian scientists, so it was just destroyed. I witnessed the destruction of 10 years of lightning and space phenomenon data that literally I'm just starting to hear scientists talk about in terms of new discoveries. So, yeah, the government's incompetent. Yeah, it will destroy things because if somebody isn't there to tell them that it's worth something, um, it won't be stored properly. Someone will come upon it later and not know what it is. It happens all the time. And people like to point out, oh, they destroyed the blueprints. Yep, that really happened. But copies of the blueprints exist on microfilm, so not a big deal. Uh, they're saying that the landing site should be able to be photographed by observatories. Well, actually, even the Hubble telescope lacks the resolution to capture such images. To see small objects or like that, the Hubble would have to orbit around the moon, not around the Earth. Uh, Keep in mind that the Hubble is designed for far distant viewing, not close up. Okay, so here's a photo that came out from one of the orbiters. A little harder to see in this picture, but essentially we have the center object is kind of blown up in the square there, and it roughly approximates the shape of the base of the lunar module. Marcus Allen, one of the people who claimed the moon landing was a hoax, uh, asked about this photo, said that no photos of hardware on the moon would ever convince him that manned landings have had happened. Uh, so we've done various laser experiments where lasers are bounced off mirrors on the moon that were left there by the astronauts. People claiming the moon hoax landing theory say, well, those are off of unmanned Russian landers that came up there. But the issue is for uh, laser to hit a mirror and enough coherent photons return back to Earth, you have to have a situation where uh, the mirror is angled properly. And that really kind of requires somebody on the ground setting it up to make it perfectly angled, at least in the past. Now, nowadays, you could probably set something up where you'd have a mirror constantly angling, but the laser experiments were done as far back as the 70s. There's no way that big moon buggy they were driving could have ever fit into that little landing module. Well, it folded up pretty tight and it was basically tucked underneath. It's kind of not even really a cargo container. It was more almost like a cargo carrier, but hung underneath rather than on top. Here's a good photo. Look at this. We got a picture of the moon's surface, but there's no stars in the sky. Whoops, this one's from the Chinese lander that went to the far side of the moon. I guess the Chinese are in on the no star conspiracy. Or maybe it's like the explanation I gave in the last video explaining why you can't see stars uh, in a picture with the sun out. Apollo 16 mission photo shows a lunar base and other astronauts in the distance. Well, it's a boulder. And if such a photo were real, why would they let it out? Uh, I don't know if they're implying that the astronauts were up there and saw a base, or if that it's just some weird implausible thing that pops up there, thus proving it's a hoax. In either case, if such a thing were really there, uh, they would have never let it see the light of day. And falls back to my original talk about how we're essentially just because you think you see something in a photo doesn't mean it's there. Uh, Another argument is that many moon landing hoax books were suppressed, and many were printed too. A lot of the times, the authors who were claiming that they were suppressed had publishers attest to how badly uh, the rejected manuscripts were written. That's not as big an issue today because pretty much anyone can publish anything. Uh, you can even put together your own video and put it up on YouTube. So, but that was a major argument some people were saying, and you'll note that the people who are making videos purporting that the moon landing was a hoax, they're not getting suppressed. Not anything like uh, videos about the coof or the videos about how long-term weather happens on Earth. Those are clearly being suppressed. People talking about moon hoaxes aren't. Okay, people claim this one is studio lights are clearly visible in the photos. This is something we call lens flares. Those of you who've held old-timey cameras will be able to attest to that. Okay, and this is a weird one. I don't even know why some of these are considered legitimate. Uh, One of the claims is that the astronauts actually landed at a later time. that the Apollo 11 was a hoax and we missed JFK's 10-year window and the real landings occurred in the mid 70s. And that's why we have moon rocks. Well, okay, so we can go. In all honesty, I kind of wished they hadn't made it to the moon in the late 60s and early 70s and they developed a better program and landed in the mid 70s, but there we are. Another claim is that the US did land, but they did it with Yugoslavian technology. Turns out that there was a viral campaign for a mockumentary about Yugoslavia being able to go to the moon first. And a lot of people in the moon hoax community took it seriously. The astronaut reflected in the visor is not holding a camera because they didn't hold the cameras that's mounted to their suit. The Apollo 17 moon takeoff video is recorded and the camera tracks the ascent. How is this even possible? Well, the camera was mounted on the moon buggy. There had been several launches before, so they knew the math of it. They had remote aiming features and it could be commanded by Earth. And then, of course, there's math. Everybody watched the Apollo missions through the NASA feed. As I mentioned in the previous video, Australia got its feed from their ground station. Also, ham radio operators were able to pick up transmissions from the Apollo mission by pointing at the moon. Another complaint is that the initial video quality from the moon was super poor, and it was done that way intentionally so that it couldn't be analyzed. In fact, what it was an issue with low information throughput. The dish for the lunar module, the lunar module mounted camera was too small to carry quality video. Another odd claim is that Russian cosmonauts landed on the moon first via a secret launch. Armstrong found the bodies. Even if Russia had a reason to not tell the world they had launched, the US, Britain would be aware of it. And even if the Soviets did accidentally kill their astronauts, wouldn't they want to take credit that they had reached the moon first? Why would Apollo lie about something like that? I would think it would be something they could gloat over. Well, they may have got here before us, but we were the only ones to make it back. Neil Armstrong's spacesuit is in a museum picture. The bottom of the boots don't look like the footprint treads left on the moon. Well, Apollo moonwalkers put over boots into their suit over their suit for better traction and protection against punctures. They were only worn outside because they were too bulky. They don't appear in the museum photos because the overboots, like several hundred other items, were left behind to lose weight so they could bring back additional moon rocks. The camera that recorded Armstrong going down the ladder is never seen in a picture of the module. Well, especially for the first mission, there were far too many targets, and the camera mounted to the ladder is a pretty boring subject. However, that camera does show up in an Apollo 15 photo. How did Armstrong deploy a camera and aim it while climbing down a ladder? The process had been automated, the arm locked into place, where the camera would get the best view of the ladder. All the settings were preset. The camera was turned on when the locking arm was put in place. The picture of the first footprint looks unnatural. Well, it's not technically a picture of the first footprint. It's the first picture of footprints after many others had been taken. The picture was part of an experiment on lunar soil. The astronaut stepped forward and then stepped back and photographed the footprint. There's a photo of Aldrin carrying an experiment that shows no antenna in one photo and shows an antenna 4 seconds later. And actually, the timestamps on that video are correct. The antenna is actually always up. In order to give it full contrast in any light condition, it was painted white on one side and black on the other. The angle change accounts for the sudden appearance and disappearance. Talk about in a lot of the photos of the astronauts, there's spots seen around them. And this is another claim for artificial lighting. Every bit of the suit was designed to be reflective for heat purposes. That's why they're so bright, and that's why you get all kinds of odd lens flares off of them. The Apollo 17 picture shows pictures of the lunar module with a big mountain and a small mountain in the same direction. Well, there's the crosshairs are there to show distance in terms of ratios, and they're actually exactly the same. The small and the large appearances are optical effects. According to records, more than 1,400 solar flares occurred during the Apollo missions. How could they have lived? And this number represents the total number of detectable solar events, not major flares that would have posed a danger to the astronauts. The records also show that no major flares occurred during the Apollo missions. But people who are more interested in a hoax don't want to look at that information closely. They're all only interested in an impressively large number that makes it sound like no one could have lived through it. The closest call came when the Apollo 12 spacecraft external radiation sensors detected a minor flare, but the interior sensors did not indicate that any appreciable amount of radiation had penetrated the spacecraft hull. All right, so that's my little slideshow for this evening. Seeing a few people jumping in on the comments, and I'm probably going to make a follow-up video after I present all the information I've got to talk about things that just came up in the comments. Some of it's illustrative of things. It's and it's good to have some good interchange of information on that kind of stuff. So if you, and just for a note, there's a couple of the pictures that were being taught, and a lot of this is from Colin's book. There are some of the pictures are almost impossible to find in terms of the ones that are hoax photos, unless you actually have the Collins book. And at this moment, I don't have a copy. I did in the past, but it didn't survive one of my moves. So, any thoughts? Please throw them in the comments section, as you guys have already been doing. If the YouTube algorithm brought you here and you're not one of my regular subscribers, please take a look back through my other titles. This isn't the only type of video I do. I have a very eclectic range of things I talk on. Certainly you might find something interesting, and consider subscribing so you can catch up on these things when they come out. If I didn't say smash the like button, smash the like button. If there's somebody out there you think might find this interesting, share it with them. Okay, well, I appreciate you spending time with me this evening. Hope to see you again in a future video.